Another urban myth I really want to bust over this series is that grant fundraising is the most sensible place for a stable income source for small charities. Number one, it will depend on your cause area as to how many grant makers there are that will support your organisation. There are causes out there, and right now, food banks is the one that springs to mind, who are thriving in grant making and making a lot of income from that because grant makers are conscious of the inequities of COVID and the cost of living crisis and have diverted funds that used to go elsewhere to supporting those people in our communities who can't afford to put food on the table or heat their houses. Whereas there are other causes, and medical research is the one that springs to mind, who have never had huge volumes of support because it's very niche. So it will depend on your cause area. It will depend if you're local on your geographic area, because some areas are lucky and have more local charities, and some areas are not lucky and do not have so many local grant makers in them. It will also depend on how long you've been running, and particularly for a startup charity, grant making is tricky because a lot of grant makers want to see a bit of financial track record. So we tend to recommend that grant making will start working for you more once you've been established for 2 years. Now that means you've got to find money in the first 2 years that isn't from grants, and there are exceptions such as lottery funds, awards for all that kind of thing. But the mainstay of grant funding will not come until you've got an established record, you've got a couple of years' accounts lodged with the Charity Commission, and that's got its own challenges. You can show some bank balances and you can show that you can manage money and that you can deliver work and make the impact that you say you're going to make. Most grant makers don't want to fund startups with no track record. Most grant makers want their money to go on work that is guaranteed to make a difference in the charitable area of which they have an interest. And that inevitably means more established charities who have a proven track record find it easier to get grants than startup charities. The other thing I want to talk about is demand. So I have been a fundraiser since 2002. I started trust fundraising in probably 2005. So next year that will be 20 years. And I can tell you, it has never been harder to raise money from grants as it is right now. Competition for grants is at an all-time high. Grant makers who used to send individual feedback are now sending emails saying applications have increased by 3,000% in this application round. It is literally impossible for us to give everybody feedback as to why they have been unsuccessful, and therefore we are sorry we cannot do that this round. A 3,000% increase in applications in a single application round. There are just more charities applying for grants than ever before. Now, the other half of that that's really important to understand and be able to articulate to the powers that be at your organisation is that grant making, grant fundraising is a fixed market pool. Now, what do I mean by that? So when you are doing individual giving fundraising, you are asking, I don't know, let's take a number, 5,000 people for regular gifts. And there is a heck of a lot more population, so you can keep growing that gift pool, right? You are unlikely to hit a critical mass of the general populace. Even Cancer Research UK and the big charities who have very broad appeal can keep growing their individual giving campaigns. And they do that by uplifting regular gifts, adding one-off gifts to their programme, and by recruiting new donors. There is not the same large pool of grant makers as there is a pool of people. There is a fixed number of grant makers, and they own a fixed amount of assets, and each of them gives away a fixed amount of money each year. We cannot write to them and ask them to uplift their gifts and uplift the direct debits by 5% or whatever. They make their own giving decisions. Their giving decisions are broadly based on the returns of investment they are making from their own investment portfolios, unless they're making their money elsewhere. So what they invest now, they will get dividends at the end of this financial year. And that is broadly and generally speaking what they will spend next year. So how well the financial markets are performing also impacts on grant making. Add to that in order to meet the extraordinary demands of COVID and the cost of living crisis that came hot on its heels, some grant makers, particularly the larger ones, made decisions to eat into their capital in order to meet demand in the short term, and will be looking to recoup that capital in the medium term. So, because right now, if they're investing less because they spent it, their return on investment is less, and therefore they can give away less at a time when we still need to be giving away more. So they're looking at ways that they can take a percentage of their investment income and reinvest that rather than give it all away in 1 year. So far we've got, it's a fixed size. They can only give away what they're going to give away, and potentially they might have to give away less now because they gave away more the last few years. And then there are some really significant players in the market who have decided to leave the market. They are closing up shop for lots of different reasons, and they are taking all of their assets and they are divesting themselves of this market. And that is having a huge impact on all of the people who had those grant makers on their prospect list. If you aren't a legacy beneficiary of one of those grant makers, then you are not getting any more gifts. If you don't get in on foil by the time it closes, the foil won't exist next year. And the same with Edward Gosling. If you haven't got in there, then it's gone. And there are these sort of half a dozen names of grant makers who are gone. So the market has just got smaller as well. And then let's talk about the grants. Grant makers tend to want to fund projects rather than core, although there are exceptions, and with long-term relationships you can build up to asking for core in some cases. But it tends to be project funding, something with a specific start, middle and end, where a grant maker can see the difference they're going to make over a fixed 1 year, 3 year, 5 year plan. They may renew again after that, but know that they are not going to want to be long-term permanent funders for that project or any other project. So we cannot rely on grant fundraising as a stable income source, because you might get your £50,000 this year, next year and the third year, and then they might even renew for years 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. But then you need to replace that money with new income. And if there aren't any other grant makers in 3, 6, 9 years' time for you to apply for, you have to find a way to cover that gap from a source other than grant fundraising. Now, I'm not an expert in individual giving, nor am I going to advocate for it, but just to give you the contrast, once you have invested in building a regular giving program in your organisation, and you continue to invest in maintaining relationships with those donors, acquiring more donors as some drop off, an uplift, you broadly do have a regular, sustainable, and importantly, unrestricted income source that your organisation will be able to rely on in the long term. So, grant making is not a stable, reliable, long-term income solution on its own for charities, but it is a really valuable source of income when you're looking predominantly for project funding for a fixed number of years.